The clock on the kitchen wall read 2:47 a.m. when I heard my daughter Karina laugh. That sharp, cutting laugh that belongs to someone who thinks nobody's listening. I was halfway down the staircase, my hand gripping the mahogany railing, when the words stopped me cold. "She's the most useless one in this family," Karina said. Her voice carried through the open doorway like broken glass. 74 years old, and what has she actually done? Built what? Created what? My youngest, Elise, giggled. That hurt worse somehow. Mom just sits there in her garden making tea. Dad left her money. That's it. That's her whole life. I stood motionless in the darkness of the stairwell, feeling the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled against the railing. 30 seconds passed. Maybe 40. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. You know that moment when everything you've done, every choice, every sacrifice, every midnight you spent awake working, suddenly feels worthless? That was my moment. That was my 2 a.m. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. But here's the thing about reaching 74 years old. You stop caring about being liked. You start caring about being true. And standing there in the dark, listening to my daughters mock the very hands that built the roof over their heads, something shifted inside me. Not rage. Not exactly. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. It was clarity. I could have turned around, gone back to bed, let it slide like I'd let everything else slide for 50 years. But that night wasn't going to be quiet anymore. I stepped down into the kitchen light, and both of them froze like deer in headlights. Karina's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. Elise's hand dropped from the counter. They looked at me standing there in my old nightgown, my silver hair loose around my shoulders, and you could see the moment they realized I'd heard everything. "Don't stop on my account," I said quietly. "I want to know more about how useless I am." This is where the real story begins, the one they never saw coming. Would you have stayed silent in that moment, or would you have spoken your truth? Tell me in the comments below. Your voice matters. Their shame only lasted about 3 seconds. Then the defensiveness kicked in. Karina straightened her spine, that familiar smirk spreading across her face. "Mom, you're being dramatic. We were just joking around." "Joking?" I repeated. I pulled out a chair and sat down directly across from both of them. The kitchen light was harsh and bright. Nobody looked good in it. So, when Elise said I've never created anything, that was a joke too? Elise looked away. That's when I knew the sting was real for her. Karina? Karina was already constructing her defense, building walls. She's always been that way. When cornered, she gets colder, meaner. Her father was the same. I think about Gregory often, especially at moments like this. 38 years of marriage to a man who was charming in public and cruel in the walls of his own home. He controlled everything. My money, my choices, my voice. Everyone in town thought he was brilliant, the real estate developer, the philanthropist, the man with golden hands. At home, those hands were fists wrapped in civility. After he died 15 years ago, I found out who I actually was. Not Mrs. Gregory Ellington, wife of the town's favorite son. Just Margaret. Margaret who could read a financial statement. Margaret who could think. Margaret who'd spent decades watching him work while pretending to be asleep. "You don't understand what built this life," I said quietly, looking at both of them. "This house. Your educations. Your trust funds. None of it came from nowhere, and it definitely didn't come from your father's name alone." Karina rolled her eyes. Elise stayed silent. Neither of them had the faintest idea that their entire world was constructed from decisions I made after Gregory passed. That I'd spent 15 years turning inherited wealth into something sustainable, into something that would last. They thought I was just the woman who sat in the garden making tea, because I liked gardens and tea. They had no idea I was the woman who'd studied offshore accounts, who'd cleaned dirty money into clean investments, who'd rebuilt a broken estate into a fortress of security. But perhaps I'd raised daughters who mistook silence for weakness. And that misunderstanding was about to cost them everything. If you've ever been underestimated by the people closest to you, leave a love emoji in the comments. Let me know I'm not alone in this. I didn't raise my voice. That's what scared them most, I think. If I'd yelled, they could have written me off as emotional, hysterical, a menopausal old woman losing her grip. But I was calm, steady, the same way I'd been when I discovered Gregory's first offshore account back in 2006. Walk with me, I said, standing up from the kitchen table. Mom, it's almost 3 in the morning, Elise protested weakly. Walk with me. Something in my tone left no room for negotiation. They followed me down the hallway into Gregory's old study, the room that had been closed for years, collecting dust and memories. The room where I'd found everything. I unlocked the filing cabinet using the key I'd kept hidden for 15 years. The folder was right where I'd left it, cream-colored, thick, full of papers that told the real story of this family. I laid it on the desk between us. Open it, I said. Karina hesitated. Elise reached out first, her fingers trembling slightly. She pulled out the first document, a transfer statement from 2009, then another. Then photographs of properties purchased in my name alone, investment portfolios, deed transfers, a complete financial history. These are yours, Elise whispered. Everything you've ever lived in, everything you've ever spent, everything you've ever taken for granted came from my hands, I said. Not your father's legacy. My work, my decisions, my recovery of what should have destroyed us all. I watched their faces as they flipped through page after page. I could see the moment reality crashed through their denial. The moment they understood that the woman standing before them wasn't some sentimental relic they'd outgrown. I was the architect of their entire existence. Your father wasn't the golden boy everyone thought he was, I continued. He had secrets, hidden money, connections to things that would have buried this family name. After he died, I spent 3 years fixing it. Quietly, alone. While you two were in college, worrying about nothing, I was rewiring your future. Karina's jaw tightened. If you were so important, why didn't you ever tell us? Because you were my daughters, I said simply. And I chose to protect you from the truth about who your father really was. But apparently, protection looked like uselessness to you. The silence that followed was different from the one at 2 a.m. This one had weight. This one had consequences. They'd finally seen the woman behind the garden and the tea. And she wasn't someone to mock. Have you ever had to prove your worth to someone who doubted you? Comment justice below. I left them there in the study while I went upstairs to bed. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a scene. I just walked away and left them with the evidence of everything they'd never bothered to ask about. Sleep didn't come easy that night. It never does when you're standing at a crossroads. But for the first time in decades, I wasn't lying awake worrying about whether I was doing the right thing. I was wondering what came next. The truth is, I'd been planning this moment for years. Not consciously, maybe, but somewhere deep down, I'd always known that one day my daughters would need to see who I really was. That kindness and silence would eventually cost me their respect. That protection without acknowledgement becomes invisibility. When Gregory was alive, I had to be invisible. I had to be quiet. I had to let him take credit for things I'd built. I'd watch him charm investors, negotiate deals, make decisions, all while I sat beside him, actually understanding the numbers better than he ever could. But a wife didn't contradict her husband in 1985. A wife didn't show him up. A wife stayed small. After he died, I made a different choice. I became large in secret. I grew while nobody was looking. I rebuilt our fortune not through inheritance, though yes, there was that, but through education, through risk, through intelligence that had been waiting 40 years to be used. I'd cleaned up Gregory's mess, because it was the right thing to do. I'd invested carefully, because that's what the money deserved. I'd remained silent about all of it because my daughters were young, and I didn't want them carrying the weight of knowing their father's corruption. But silence, when taken for granted, becomes a different kind of lie. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. Do you agree? Like this video if you do. Now, In the darkness of my bedroom at 3:47 a.m., I made a decision that would change everything. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer, Harold Benton. He didn't answer. Nobody answers their phone at 4 a.m., but he would in the morning. Because what I was about to do required someone I could trust. Someone who understood that quiet justice was still justice. The document I'd been mentally drafting for years was suddenly urgent. The plan I'd carried with me, just in case, was becoming real. And nothing in my daughter's lives would ever be the same again. Harold Benton arrived at my kitchen table at 10 a.m. with coffee and a legal pad. He was used to me by now, had been my lawyer for 8 years, and he knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. But even he looked shocked when I laid out what I wanted to do. "You're going to transfer everything?" he asked, confirming what I'd already said. "Everything that matters," I replied. "The properties, the investments, the trust accounts. All of it goes into a foundation for widows and single mothers. The house in Boston, the commercial properties in Vermont, the stocks. All of it." "Margaret, that's approximately." "I know what it is, Harold. I've been calculating it for 15 years. He set his pen down and looked at me over his reading glasses. "This is about what happened last night. It wasn't a question. Small towns have big ears, and lawyers who've been around long enough understand that dramatic financial moves are usually rooted in something personal." "Partly," I said. "But it's also about what should have happened a long time ago. I've spent my life giving things to people who didn't appreciate them. I'm done with that. If my daughters want to live like women of means, then they're going to have to earn it. They're going to have to understand that nothing comes from nothing." "What about them?" "Karina's accounts, Elisa's trust." "Frozen," I said firmly. "Effective immediately. They keep the house they're living in. I'm not heartless, but the monthly stipend stop. The credit card stop. The safety net that's enabled their entitlement stops." Harold's pen moved across the legal pad with swift, practiced strokes. He was a good man. He'd helped me rebuild after Gregory died. He understood that mercy and consequences weren't opposites. They were sometimes the same thing. It took 6 hours. By 4 p.m., the paperwork was drafted and signed. By 6 p.m., the electronic transfers were initiated. By 7 p.m., I knew my daughters' lives had just changed in ways they couldn't begin to understand. At 7:43 p.m., my phone rang. Karina. Her voice was high and tight. "Mom, there's been some kind of mistake with my account. My credit card was declined at dinner." I listened to the panic rising in her voice like a wave building on the shore. Behind her, I could hear Elise in the background asking what was happening. "No mistake," I said quietly. "What do you mean, no mistake?" "I have a reservation at the Marlborough Hotel this weekend. The card won't process. The bank said something about—" "The resources are gone, Karina," I interrupted. "The accounts are frozen. The stipends have stopped. As of this afternoon, you and your sister are living on whatever you can earn or create yourselves." The silence on the other end of the line was sharp enough to cut. "You can't do this," she whispered. "You can't just take everything back." "Actually, I can," I said. "It was always mine to give and mine to take away. You called me useless this morning. I'm going to show you just how useful a useless woman can be." I hung up the phone, and, for the first time in years, I felt light. Not cruel, not satisfied in a mean way. Just lighter. Like I'd put down something I'd been carrying for far too long. But what I didn't know yet was how this decision would unfold. How it would hurt. How it would eventually heal. Would you have done the same? Share your thoughts below. And this is where the real reckoning begins. 3 months passed in silence. Real silence this time, not the kind I was used to. The kind that comes after everything's been said and the dust settles. I didn't expect them to call. I didn't expect letters. I certainly didn't expect what arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper. Karina's handwriting, shaky, careful, like she'd rewritten it 100 times. Inside was a handwritten letter that took me 10 minutes to read because I had to stop and cry twice. "Mom," it started. Just that. Just Mom, like she was remembering how to say it. She told me she'd gotten a job at a boutique downtown. Entry level. Nothing fancy. She was making minimum wage plus commission, living in a studio apartment with a roommate named Jessica, learning how to budget because she'd never had to before. She wrote about the shame of it, having to tell people her new reality, watching their faces shift when they realized the Ellington daughter was working retail. She wrote about the relief of it too, something I didn't expect. The relief of not wondering if anyone liked her for her money, because clearly nobody was interested in her for anything else. I understand now, she'd written.
About you.
About why you didn't make a big deal out of everything you did. Because making a big deal means needing people to care. And you were strong enough not to need that. I kept that letter on my nightstand for months. Elise took longer. She spiraled first. I heard through town gossip, and yes, I listened when people brought me information that she'd struggled hard. Her marriage fell apart because her husband had been attracted to the Ellington money, not to Elise herself. When the money disappeared, so did he. She'd moved back to her childhood bedroom in our old house for 6 weeks, and there was a period where I worried she might not make it through. But Elise had something Karina didn't have when they were younger.
Depth.
The kind that comes from asking hard questions about yourself. She showed up at my cottage on a rainy Thursday afternoon, soaking wet from walking.
She didn't call first.
She just appeared at my door like a ghost coming back to itself. I don't have an excuse, she said immediately. I'm not here to convince you I've changed. I'm just here to tell you that I see you.
I've always seen you, Mom.
I just didn't want to. We sat in my kitchen for 4 hours. She told me about her new job at the library, how much she loved it, how she was thinking about going back to school to get her degree in social work. She told me about therapy and about understanding that her cruelty that night had been born from entitlement and fear. She told me she was sorry. I told her I loved her. That was all I needed to say. The months that followed weren't about restoration. I didn't suddenly give them their money back. That wasn't the point. The point was that they'd finally seen the woman behind the woman they thought they knew. They'd finally understood that love without gratitude is just dependence wearing a prettier dress. If you believe in second chances, type forgive in the comments. My cottage, the small one I'd bought years ago on the edge of town, became the quiet center of my life. It had 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced east, and a garden that demanded everything I could give it. The roses were what saved me. Not symbolically, though I know they're symbolic, but actually, physically. Getting my hands in that soil, feeling the thorns bite when I wasn't paying attention, watching something grow from your own effort, that's a different kind of wealth than money ever was. I spent mornings watering, afternoons reading financial reports for the foundation I'd created, evenings sitting on the porch with chamomile tea, watching the sun move across the lake. The town had opinions about me, naturally. Some called me cruel, a mother who'd punished her daughters out of spite. Some called me wise, a woman who'd finally stood up for herself. The pastor at the church I don't attend suggested in a sermon that forgiveness required me to restore what I'd taken. A few of my old friends stopped calling, but the women who mattered started appearing. Widows, single mothers, women who'd been written off as useless. The foundation I'd created was giving them grants for education, for starting businesses, for rebuilding lives after loss. They knew who I was. And they knew what it meant to be seen, finally, as someone who mattered. Karina started visiting on Sunday afternoons. She'd bring coffee and sit in the garden while I worked. We didn't talk about the past much anymore. We talked about her job, about the young woman she was becoming when she wasn't performing for anyone. She was kinder to herself now. That was the real change. Elise came by on Wednesday evenings, and we'd walk the perimeter of the property while she told me about the books she was reading, the clients at the library who reminded her of people in her own past, the slow work of becoming who she actually was instead of who she'd been trained to be. They thought they took everything from me when I redistributed the money, but they never realized I'd already found everything I needed.
Peace. Clarity.
The knowledge that I'd spent my life building something real, and now I was building something for people who'd been invisible like I'd been. Never let anyone define your worth. Hit like if you agree. On a cold day in early November, I did something I hadn't done since Gregory's funeral. I went to the cemetery. The headstone was gray marble, polished smooth. Gregory Michael Ellington, 1948 to 2010, beloved husband and father. Nobody had bothered to be honest on there. Nobody mentioned the money he'd stolen, the women he'd cheated with, the way he'd controlled everything and everyone around him through charm and manipulation. I stood there for a long time, not saying anything. My hands were cold. The wind was starting to turn mean, pushing winter toward us. "I survived you," I said finally. My voice sounded strange in the open air. "I spent 38 years trying to make you better than you were, and then I spent 15 years cleaning up your mess. And I want you to know that I don't hate you anymore. I don't even think about you much, actually. You were just a man who wanted control, and I was just a woman who finally learned she didn't need your permission to exist." I pulled a single rose from my bag, one of the pale pink ones I'd been growing. I laid it on the cold stone. "The thing about silence," I continued, "is that it's not always what it looks like. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's planning. Sometimes it's the loudest thing a person can do." I was silent for so long, and people mistook it for weakness. My daughters mistook it for uselessness. But it was actually the only place I knew how to be strong. The wind moved through the trees. It whispered, but it wasn't him I heard. It was me. My own voice, older now, clearer, finally knowing what it wanted to say. "I'm not angry anymore," I said. "And that's my victory. Not the money I moved or the accounts I froze. My victory is that your death gave me my life back. And I'm grateful for that." I walked away lighter. Not because I'd forgiven him. Forgiveness was too small a word for what had happened. But because I'd finally understood that holding on to what he'd done was only giving him more power. And I'd already given him enough. If you've ever let go of pain to find peace, drop a flower emoji below. The Riverside Women's Charity Gala happens every November. It's one of those events where everyone important in town shows up, and you spend the evening in a ballroom watching people perform versions of themselves that nobody really believes in. I almost didn't go. I'm not good at events. I never have been. But the foundation had been nominated for recognition, and they were asking me to say a few words. So I bought a dress, nothing fancy, just a simple navy thing that fit, and I went. The ballroom was crowded. Chandeliers, catering, the usual dance of small talk and networking. I was standing by the window, looking at the view of the city lights, when I felt a hand on my arm. It was Karina, and beside her, Elise. Both of them in dresses I'd never seen before, both of them standing taller than I remembered. "We want you to know we're here," Karina said quietly. "The foundation is your work, but we wanted to be here for it." I didn't say anything. I just looked at both of them and felt something settle in my chest. This wasn't forgiveness from them or from me. This was understanding. This was the complicated love that comes after you've been honest with each other about who you really are. Later, when I was called to the podium, I said what I needed to say. I told the story of the foundation. I talked about the women we'd helped, the lives that had changed, the quiet power of giving people the tools to rebuild themselves. And when I finished, I looked out at the crowd, and I saw my daughters standing, applauding. For once, they spoke my name with pride. Not because I was their mother, not because I'd given them things, but because they could finally see who I actually was. And in that silence, after their applause faded, I heard justice breathe. If you believe that truth always comes to light, like this video. I'm sitting by the window now, same window where this all started. It's late afternoon, and the light is turning golden the way it does in November, when winter's almost here. There's a cup of tea beside me. Chamomile again, always chamomile, and I'm thinking about time. When you reach 74, you understand that time isn't something you have a lot of left. So you become careful about what you spend it on. You stop performing. You stop explaining yourself to people who've already made up their minds. You stop being quiet about the things that matter. I've been quiet for a long time. Quiet through my marriage to a man who didn't deserve my silence. Quiet through the years after his death, when I was rebuilding everything he destroyed. Quiet through the slow work of raising daughters who would eventually have to learn who I was without me telling them. But that night at 2 a.m., when I heard them call me useless, That was the end of a different kind of quiet. That was the beginning of the kind of silence that's actually an answer. That's actually the loudest thing you can say. My daughter's visit now. Not out of obligation. Out of want. Karina's becoming someone she likes. Elise is building a life that belongs to her. And I'm here in this cottage, watching my roses sleep before winter, knowing that I did that. Not by being loud, not by being controlling, but by finally refusing to be invisible. This is what I want you to understand if you're watching this. Your worth isn't determined by what you give away. It's not in the houses you provide or the money you sacrifice. Your worth is inherent. It's the simple fact that you exist and you matter. And if the people around you can't see that, then maybe they need to learn to look harder. And maybe you need to be willing to show them exactly what they've been missing. I looked at my daughters tonight over dinner, and I smiled because they finally saw me. Not the version of me I'd created for their comfort. Not the silent woman in the garden, but Margaret.
Whole. Real.
A woman who'd spent her life building things and had finally learned to take credit for that. Quiet justice isn't about vengeance. It's not about punishment. It's about peace earned through truth. It's about standing in your own power and letting the world adjust to that, rather than shrinking yourself to make everyone comfortable. That night, silence wasn't pain anymore. It was victory. Thank you so much for watching this story with me. If this touched your heart or reminded you of your own journey, please like this video. Drop a comment below. Tell me your story. Tell me about a time when you had to stand up for yourself. Tell me about the quiet power you've discovered in your own life. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. Someone out there is going to read your comment and realize they're not alone in their struggle. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Because we have more coming. More tales of quiet justice. More stories about women finding their power. More reminders that the softest voices sometimes tell the strongest stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a friend who's been invisible. Maybe it's someone you love who's forgotten their own worth. Maybe it's someone who needs to know that standing up for yourself isn't cruel, it's necessary. I'll be back soon with another story. Until then, remember, you are not useless. You have never been useless. And the people who matter will eventually see that. Sometimes they just need a little help finding their way to the truth. Thank you. And I'll see you in the next one.